Good day, and welcome to Glasnost in Our Time, where we try to look at the history of the world rationally in the hope that it will look rationally back. I'm your host, Anthony D'Agostino. It's July 13th, 2023. NATO has met in Vilnius. Ukraine has been told that it will not be admitted to NATO. President Zelensky angrily calls this decision absurd. Zelensky is no doubt concluding that he will have to win the war in order to get into NATO. And NATO will back him as long as he can make the Ukrainians fight. But how long can he make them fight? On the other hand, Sweden will now be admitted. Turkey has dropped its conditional demand that Turkey be admitted to the EU prior to the Turkish vote for Ukrainian admission to NATO. Turkey has accepted a second-class ticket in the Western Alliance and again put distance between itself and Russia. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian offensive is sputtering. The Ukrainian blitzkrieg with tank columns looks like it's a failure. Will Russian blitzkrieg follow, or is the defense supreme? And if that's true, can Russia be satisfied with a stalemate? Well, while we wait to see how the world turns, let's talk a little bit about history. In this case, history as told by a Marxist historian, maybe the greatest Marxist historian of the 20th century, Isaac Deutscher. He would get my vote as the greatest historian of the 20th, certainly the greatest Marxist historian of the 20th century. He was the author of the famous 3-volume biography of Trotsky, influential biography of Stalin, and many other impressive historical works. And to discuss Deutscher, we have with us today Gonzalo Pozo Martin. He's a professor of political science at the University of Stockholm. He's working on a biography of Isaac Deutscher. And a few weeks ago, he published a fascinating essay in the London Review of Books on Deutscher's exile in London during World War II. When Deutscher was writing for The Economist and The Observer, and later on he would write for the New York Times Magazine. He would do a lot of writing for Western periodicals. So we're hoping to find out more about Deutscher. So welcome to Glasnost, Gonzalo Pozo Martin.
Thank you.
Let me ask you, Deutscher is well known to historians as a biographer of Trotsky and also as a follower of Trotsky. But you say, and of course, I think that's probably right, that he was not exactly a Trotskyist. You also say that when he came to London in exile from Poland in 1940, that politically speaking, he considered himself completely alone. How's that?
Yeah, thanks for the very good question. I think there's several levels to unpack there. That part of the narrative in the essay is all told by him. So this is his own account. And I think that in a sense that spares us from a lot of meta-analysis. The fact is that Deutscher did not consider himself part of any Trotskyist platform. Certainly after 1939, after his arrival in London, and he remained in his own self-description independent of any platform, coterie, little coterie of a sect, and so on. He goes on slightly poisonously about that, and makes a point about that for the rest of his life. And this is a decision that he takes very early on in the winter of 39-40, being in London. And as he says himself in his little self-memoir, I could not imagine I was retreating from politics for good, which is quite a claim for someone whose first half whose first half of his life had been entirely about communist militancy and activism in an outlawed communist party in Poland. So I think, you know, it's an interesting story because you can cut Deutscher's biography in two halves. After 39, at the age of 30, roughly a little older than that, he is Deutscher, the intellectual living in exile, living in London. Eventually, he becomes a British citizen in 49 and lives for the rest of his life in London, and he never goes back to Poland. But the first half of his life in Poland is a kind of permanent quest for identity and crossing barriers and different forms of heresy, but very steeped in politics from very early on. And I think this is important. So between 1926, when Deutscher joins the, as I've said, the banned Communist Party of Poland, to 1932, when he's exiled, he's expelled from the party. We can come to the reasons, to the circumstances of his expulsion, if you like, later on. Deutscher certainly suffers a very drastic change in his political views. In 1930, even in the spring of 1931, he's still putting out very clearly not exactly Stalinist, but very hardline party line pieces, mostly through his work in the Yiddish periodicals, but other. I mean, Deutscher was an extremely intelligent and sophisticated intellectual, so he was never a pure sort of unthinking Stalinist. But he kept the line, he kept the party line very clearly, right up until 1931, when he is invited by the party or asked by the party to go to the Soviet Union to attend some of the sessions of the Internationale. And there he travels quite amply. And when he comes back, he is both awed by what he saw, but also deeply shaken in his convictions. And it's around this time that a small anti-Stalinist opposition faction is forming within the party in Poland, and Deutscher joins them. And what they start doing is to translate and disseminate Trotskyist literature in the bulletins of the opposition, and so on and so forth. So the party, which of course has a very tough line against any kind of Trotskyist deviations, eventually expels him and his comrades in 1932. And since 1932, he is a kind of one-man show, sometimes within the Polish Socialist Party, and other times just alone, but trying to get his head around broader historical questions, reading Capital very closely, and so on and so forth. But the idea that he simply represents some kind of classic Trotskyist figure, I think would be wrong. There is a kind of voyage, intellectual transition there, a slightly painful one, and it never results in Deutscher becoming a sort of uncomplicated member of the Fourth International or any of the other Trotskyist parties in the US or in Britain and so on. He's close to them. He's in constant dialogue with them throughout his life, but he never joins them. So Deutscher had a very strong sense of his own independence. You might call it vanity, I don't know.
So let me ask you what you think about the early part of it, although this is a terrible question to ask someone, but, you know, I've written on the topic and I'm sort of deep in the weeds of the factional side of the issue. So I have to ask you because this is the thing you know. It seems to me that when Deutscher joined the party in 1927, I thought, you said 26, doesn't matter. But when Trotsky joined the party, they had already been denouncing Trotskyism for some time. And this is pretty much the work, not of Stalin, but of Zinoviev in 1923-4, and then of Bukharin. Deutscher was attached to the people who were closest to Bukharin, it strikes me, rather than those who were close to Zinoviev when he joined the party. So he must have parroted a lot of what they said about Trotsky. I think it would have to be the first desideratum of a communist in those days, to say you were for so-called Leninism and you were against so-called Trotskyism. So that must have been his line. And I guess he turned against this line, not over Trotsky, but over the whole question of the third period line, the line they adopted at the Sixth Comintern Congress in 1928, right?
Yeah,
isn't that it? It's a question of calling for a united front rather than a opposition to the other socialist parties.
yeah, that's right, and it's quite explicit. And even though the story gets rehearsed by Deutscher in the prologues to the Trotsky trilogy, and that kind of invites the reader to think that, you know, here's a fellow Trot who's been, you know, on that train all along. That's not the story. Indeed, as you say, Deutscher joined quite young. By the time Deutscher joined the party, he was an up-and-coming, you know, teenage, sort of poetic wunderkind, publishing his own verse, which is still there, it's still available. A modernist, trying to find his own voice in the Polish press, doing some literary criticism, and doing a little bit of journalistic chronicling. Very interesting, because in 1926 he gets to cover a very bloody 1st of May event, and that's all published. And so this is a very young Deutscher, you know, sort of aghast discovering politics, but I think it's in a very Polish context. And as you say, as the decade unfurls, the party takes an extremely extreme line against any kind of cooperation between the Communist Party and the socialists, who, according to Moscow, should be considered nothing better than social fascists. And this is in the context of a kind of very authoritarian, obnoxious dictatorship, the Sanacja regime, in most of the time under the government of Piłsudski.
Marshal Piłsudski.
And it's that Deutscher very strongly sort of jumps against. In 1932, the piece he gets expelled for is he's looking sideways into Germany, looking at the rise of the National Socialist, Hitler, and you know, essentially saying that it's a historical mistake and it's a betrayal of the working class, that particular Comintern line of non-cooperation with the socialists is throwing the German working class under the bus. Those are his own words, among many other sort of instances of passion and but also prescience, I think, historical prescience. And so sure enough, he is denounced. He's denounced for Trotskyism, though. And I think that's a little bit the confusion, even though there's not much of a Trotskyist tradition in Poland. And so, you know, the Communist Party was very small in terms of its membership. It's not a mass party comparable to those of some other European countries. But the Trotskyist dissidents was just a handful of people. There might be more on Zoom here than Trotskyists at that time. So it's an extremely minimal.
It's always like that with
nothing wrong with that. Absolutely.
Any new idea, you know, Jesus only had 12 disciples.
That's
right. 12 apostles.
That's right. Fewer, better fewer, but better.
Better fewer than
But
but better.
but he gets expelled on those grounds, and then essentially becomes increasingly close to the message and the content of Trotskyism, and I think that's the better understanding. But Deutscher emerges essentially a critic of Stalinism in Poland, and I think also, and we have very little notion about this, also his trip to the Soviet Union seems to have been a big moment for him in his realization of what is not so great and what must be salvaged in the Soviet Union, because Deutscher never renounces his communism and never renounces his fidelity towards the Soviet Union and the Bolshevik Revolution.
And he was also close to the Zionists, I guess. And you say that he wrote for Nasz Przegląd, and it was a Zionist theoretical journal. So tell us something about his relationship with the Zionists.
Well, Deutscher is born in a very special place called Grzanów, 10 kilometers or so away from Auschwitz. This is a place where the Jewish population was about 50%, or even at sometimes maybe even more than that. If you visit the town now, you'd never guess that was the case not so long ago, but that's true. And he came from a family where there was some very important Jewish luminaries. Deutscher's uncle sat in the Polish legislature representing a Jewish party. Deutscher had a sister who emigrated very quickly to Palestine in one of the Alishot. So Zionism.
He lost everybody else, did he not?
And everybody else eventually died. His father, his mother, his sister, his brother
died. They were liquidated. They were yeah.
We don't know exactly where, but they disappear. They disappear between 1942 and 1943, probably in the evacuation of the Krakow ghetto, where they were all, I mean, there's a documentary thread that puts them there in the winter of 42. And we've got their address in the Krakow ghetto in the winter of 42. Then the ghetto is liquidated shortly afterwards. And the trace is never recovered. So they disappear somewhere there, and they're assassinated, right? But his half-sister had already been in Israel. I say half-sister because his father married twice. Deutscher was the son of his father's second marriage. His half-sister Hala had strong Zionist convictions and made the trip to Israel, took a ship and walked all the way from Haifa up the coast to a particular settlement where part of the family still lives. So there's a strong element of Zionism that always was around Deutscher, and in his early teenage years, he seems to have had some convictions. Now, this is a little bit tricky, and it belongs a little bit into the realm of family lore, what he thought about that. In his politics, from very early on, Deutscher becomes a communist, and he criticizes, he's frontal against Zionism, the Zionist project. He cannot see the point of a kind of rising petty nationalism in a context where the power of nations, as he sees it, is historically on the decline. That's one kind of way in which he criticizes Zionists very strongly, mostly after the war. But even before the war, he's got the sense that Zionism is a form of political backwardness, of embracing, holding on to very traditionalist and not nearly progressive enough identities and forms of politics. So he's, from very early on, he wants to transcend Zionism, and it's very clear that he sees in communist internationalism the way beyond Zionism. But then he has all his life a slightly more complicated relationship to Israel and the Zionist project, and it's an evolving one. So that moves until the very end of his life, the positions change. But for most of his life, I think he was not a Zionist. I think that would not be a good characterization. But sorry, he did write in Nasz Przegląd, our review. It just happened to be the main.
We should say that Nasz Przegląd translates as what? Our point of view,
our review.
Outlook?
Our review.
Okay.
And our review was a fantastic daily, very cosmopolitan, incredibly good coverage, incredibly good international political coverage. Of course, one of the stellar international correspondents was Deutscher's great close friend, Bernhard Singer, father of Daniel Singer, who is another friend and fellow comrade and traveler for many years. And, you know, great cultural pages and so on, and a Zionist Jewish newspaper, daily, published in Warsaw up until basically the German occupation, where it suddenly disappears as well, of course, but in Polish, in the Polish language, which at this time, Deutscher, like many other intellectuals of his particular origin, is besotted with. He's in love with the Polish language. Deutscher is born in a Yiddish household and discovers Polish poetry and makes a transition, a linguistic transition to Polish, and tries to become a Polish Jew, which is another sort of very complicated relationship to identity and nation. So I think one of the very interesting things that we could see in his little memo in the text of the LRB that you mentioned is that when the war comes, he doesn't consider being Jewish a problem when it comes to joining the Polish army in exile, because nationally he says, I consider myself a Pole.
So you know the communists supported Piłsudski when he came to power in 1926, is it? Yeah, May of 26. They said it was the part of the revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry, this old slogan of Lenin's from 1905. They said Piłsudski was a kind of a feature of that, this terrific position they took, which they later on called the May Error. So they were with Piłsudski in the beginning, and so they sort of had to be with him. Well, not with Piłsudski died, but sort of had to be with him throughout. Did they not? They were to some degree Polish nationalists.
Yeah, I think, and it's quite interesting to follow that whole story, which goes a long way back to the very founding of the party. And you know, there you connect with figures like Rosa Luxemburg. So Deutscher is a bridge between the very classics of Bolshevism and socialist revolutionaries of the 20th century, is a bridge between 1917 and the New Left in a very obvious, clear way, almost in a biographical, direct sense. So the party he joins has a very specific national context, as you say, and a very sort of often tortured relationship with the question of national identity. When Trotsky is about to extend, if you know, take the Red Army into Warsaw, Karl Radek warns him about Poles and their very strong nationalist feelings, and you know, the sense that their ultimate fidelity might not lie with the Red Army indeed.
Yeah, yeah. So Deutscher was first known, before he wrote on Trotsky, he was first known as a biographer of Stalin. So, tell us something about the Stalin biography, would you? Why was that so sensational?
Well, Deutscher, arrives in London in 1939, struggles for a bit, joins the Polish army in exile, gets sent away for being a troublemaker, essentially because he denounced all the rife anti-Semitism in the ranks of the Polish army in exile. Comes back and begins a career, a very successful career as a journalist in Fleet Street, mostly for The Economist magazine, but also for The Observer and occasionally for other publications. He's even sent to post-war Germany as a correspondent, where he has some wonderful journalism. But then at some point, he decides he can no longer fight the Cold War, from that particular platform. And that he's surrounded by people who politically and sociologically and so on are very different to him. And by that time, he's married to, or about to be married to, Tamara Deutscher, who says, look, you're wasting your time with so much journalism. You're a historian, you're a writer. Why don't you just do that? And so eventually he quits Fleet Street and journalism. He will continue writing pieces and texts for the European press for, till the end of his life, mostly, not only, but also as a way of making ends meet, so often.
So he left them. They were still willing to run his articles. Yeah.
And there were different attempts to try to cajole him back, but he resisted. This is about 1946. And in about 2 years or so, Deutscher churns out this really magnificent and I think kind of complicated biography of Stalin, which eventually appears with Oxford University Press in 1949. Now, why is this, as you say, such a sensational text? I mean, it very quickly gets translated into other languages. It's the object of a lot of commentary, and Deutscher gets endless flack, both left and right. And well, you can imagine, Deutscher is trying to do something which from the very darkest point of the Cold War is extremely difficult, which is to treat Stalin as a kind of objective fact, to accept the historical reality of Stalin, to look at Stalin, to coin a phrase, realistically, in the hope that that story might look back at him rationally. This is too far for many, and not far enough for many others. So he's not about to write a hagiography of Stalin. And in fact, Stalin has been his political opponent for many years. And in a sense, there's something in the Stalin biography that tells us that, Deutscher in a way had been preparing this book for much of his mature life, political life. He'd been engaging with Stalin for much of his life already. So politically, this is not a very complicated book for him. And at the same time, he's not about simply demonizing the character and scrapping all that away. There must be a real reckoning, and I think this suggests something that is very characteristic of Deutscher, which is a certain ethics and a certain commitment and honesty. Like writing realistically about Stalin is about the acknowledgement of a defeat, a political defeat at the hands of a kind of very reactionary force, which at the same time is a kind of incubus, a kind of weird transformation of the original October Revolution. And so the third element why this is a very spectacular book is that Stalin is still alive when it comes out. What other books on Stalin can one think of that scope and that political depth, trenchancy at the time of Stalin's, when Stalin was alive? I don't think I can match it with many others. Maybe
Yeah,
Trotsky's own writings on Stalin, maybe.
The only biography of Stalin up to that time, only respectable biography that available, was Boris Suvarin, Stalin in 1936, if I'm not wrong. Oh, and there's an Isaac Levine book on Stalin, I think from 31 or something. So Deutscher still had a lot original to say about Stalin. And at the end of it, he ends up saying Stalin's like Cromwell, Robespierre, and Napoleon. What do you think of that?
I don't know what I think about that, Anthony, to be honest. And I don't know what I think about that because I don't know what Deutscher really, I don't know how coherent that is in terms of Deutscher's own thinking about the whole Soviet experience and the Russian Revolution, because he's extremely ambivalent in the end. I think what he means is that there's a kind of internal defeat of the Bolshevik Revolution, and at the same time, there's a kind of movement forward. Deutscher is very keen to hope for a situation where one can claim that there is no iron law of history, say, a Napoleon or a Robespierre or a Cromwell and so on, that has applied to 1917. He's very explicit about that in some fragments in different texts. And then in others, he has to accept that there's been this kind of situation. And I think historiographically is extremely interesting. This is a biography, but is it a biography of an individual, in the sense that we can read so many biographies about the minutest psychological realities of Stalin's, brain, and we can learn all about what Stalin was wearing, what kind of color of underwear he had the day that his wife committed suicide. There's all kind of biographies like that, Simon Sebag, Montefiore, all the incredible details, but they're not historically significant, right?
Well, but the argument that they always had about Deutscher was the statement he makes about Stalin being historically necessary.
Yeah.
Historically necessary. What do you think of that?
Historically necessary. I think, yeah, what I think about that is that there is an extreme sense of trying to work through the very unpleasant reality of Stalin. And there's an element of Trotsky's sophistry here, I think, of casuistry, and, that's a very theoretically convoluted understanding of that. Does Deutscher really want us to believe that the movement of events like 1917 is so independent of their politics, of their personalities? The great biographer of Stalin, of Trotsky, and had time allowed, of Lenin, putting forward such a mechanicist understanding of this is hard to agree with, I think. At the same time, and that's a kind of sustenance for Deutscher's essential point about the Bolshevik Revolution, which is that even if defeated, even if betrayed, it could not be taken back, so that it also was a reality that was here to stay and could eventually be redeemed, and that the kinds of progressive triumphs that it had, education of swathes of people who until very recently had been condemned to illiteracy, immense economic development and so on. His great faith was that Soviet man would be clever and able and willing to take on some kind of reform. so that the seed of the Bolshevik Revolution had been planted. It was too late to take that back, and eventually it would come back. So there's a kind of article of faith and an expectation, and I think in 1948, Deutscher's assessment of Stalin is trying to work that through. I should say that, of course, Deutscher worked through a couple of more additions to the Stalin biography up until 1962, I think. And he is very clear that he was right in 1948, or for 1949, so that he didn't take back he didn't revise anything too substantial about his own thesis. At any rate, one has to see the Stalin biography in context with Trotsky and in context with eventually a book on Lenin, plus, and this would have been the whole life project together, plus some kind of economic and social history of the USSR. And he had been on contract to finish the last two books, the Lenin biography and social history of the USSR, since the 1950s. So he would have done a kind of biographical triptych plus the deeper structural history of the USSR, right? And we don't have the last two books. We don't have the Lenin biography. We only have the first chapter of that, Lenin's childhood, and everything else that Deutscher writes about the social and economic history of the USSR has to be gleaned from his other books on the subject, right? Russia after Stalin, the Trevelyan lectures, and so on and so forth.
And he
so
took
this,
position.
Sorry.
Go ahead. What were you going to say?
Yeah, there's a real attempt to work out the specificities of individual characters and leaders, tragedies of history, and then the more, the structural, deeper structural mechanics of the revolution. So the biographies shouldn't be seen as something that would have stood alone. They should have stood atop of a much sort of deeper study that Deutscher had been sort of dreaming about since he left Poland, in fact. And that never came to be. So this is kind of an incomplete project, right? So I think we have to be very admiring of his breadth and of his ambition and honesty, commitment, and so on.
It's extraordinary.
Yeah.
He also wrote about Mao and about Khrushchev, and in fact, he even saw some echoes of the quarrel between Khrushchev and Mao, some echoes of the Stalin-Trotsky quarrel earlier. Do you think that stuff holds up? The stuff he wrote about communism after Stalin, do you think that holds up?
I think it depends on what kind of scale you judge it by. I think one can read it and try to put oneself in the vantage point of the 50s, say, and 53, 54, 55, of someone who has a kind of very long engagement with history and a very kind of deep notion of politics and history, but at the same time is being called on permanently to comment on the events of yesterday. And in that sense, I think his readings of the conjuncture certainly stand, at least in the sense that they tend to be superior and further seeing than many others. And so again, that's not nothing, especially if we consider that he was always working without the kind of infrastructure of the established journalist or the established academic. Essentially, he was a freelancer working with his wife, with his life companion who helped him. But that was basically most of, as much as his support went. I think in the long term, no, I think we have to, in a sense, see that if Deutscher was in any way right about many of the things he said during the Cold War, it's certainly not for the reasons he thought that he would be, that he was right. And I think this This goes for the, for Khrushchev and China. This goes for the Soviet Union and that experience in general. Events really didn't pan out the way he thought. And it also even goes in the sense for his commentary on Israel in the last couple of years of his life, right? So just at the time when he's coming back to...
Tell us a little bit about that, would you, please?
Yeah, well, as I say, he thinks there's something very tragic about the foundation of a nation state on the basis of the immense tragedy that European Jewry suffered at the hands of Hitlerism. And he thinks that it's a kind of, well, he's got this immensely, I think, moving, and it shows you the quality of the thinker, this kind of ethical quality that I've alluded to. He, at some point in The Non-Jewish Jew, in one of those essays, he says, I'd rather have the 6 million Jews back and throw away the Jewish state, right? So this is about real life, not the reification of any kind of national, basically any kind of project. He considers it very tragic that the birth of the state of Israel is somehow a kind of posthumous, sinister tribute gone wrong to Hitler. It's kind of some form of vindication or testament to Hitler's crimes, right? So he can be very extremely thought-provoking on the issue of Israel. But then other times he writes much less critically of the whole politics of Israel. And I think that his own relationship is ambivalent. He visited Israel in the 1950s and had a chance to see some of the, if you like, the better aspects, and to meet a lot of people from the old country of Poland, who then he went back to see in Israel, and to see some of the achievements of the growing state of Israel. And he's got time for the sense that what has happened there is a double tragedy. So first, the Nazis, in a sense, light up a fire in a house, and the Jews have to jump out of the window. Those are the terms in which he describes it. And in their haste to escape the flames and survive, they land on someone else who happens to be an unwilling victim, a kind of accidental victim. Those are the Palestinians, presumably. I mean, I think Deutscher, I don't think that's a great analogy for many reasons. There's way less of the accidental in the tragedy of the Palestinians. And it's clear that Deutscher doesn't always recognize that kind of dynamic. So it's kind of one tragedy sets off another tragedy. Of course, the tragic mode is very strong in Deutscher's writings, but that can often read as a lack of sensitivity, I think, for the broader politics of the Middle East.
Mm-hmm. You also say that nowadays there's a Deutscher Prize.
Yeah.
I think it still exists, this Deutscher Prize.
Sure.
And that is to say, there are a great many people in Britain, on the left, I guess, in Britain, who regard him as a great, great historian. I do too. I feel the same way. He's a great historian. And who, give him his proper due in many, keep his name alive. Whereas in Poland, he's a nobody. He's a nothing.
Yeah.
How do you figure this?
I think that's less surprising. I mean, so Deutscher moves to London in 1939 and stays there, becomes a British citizen, becomes a Londoner, and in a kind of in a kind of tenuous way, becomes a member of a kind of intellectual elite. He even has a club in London that he's a member of. So there's elements of, you know, him writing for The Economist, he always keeps his fears politics, his fears independence, and so on. But he joins a kind of
well, writing for The Economist, doesn't that say that he wanted to speak to all classes, that he, you know, did not want to argue to the choir necessarily, but he wanted to speak to all classes and speak to history generally? I mean, am I taking that too far?
No, I don't think so. But I think that his it's a professional move. I think he arrives in London. It's very clear that he's got nowhere to go to and no money. And the only thing he knows is journalism, because he's been a proof editor for 14 years. And, you know, the smell of the printing ink and the newspaper reels and so on is his life. It's all he knows. So he tries his luck in several places, and he gets very lucky at The Economist because there's a particular editor who's a very special sort of character and open to the talents of Deutscher's kind, and recognizes immediately Deutscher's potential and so on. And from there, he has a very successful career. I think you're right. You're completely right that he wants to. He certainly wouldn't want to become someone who's just writing for the, you know, preaching to the converted, preaching to his particular niche. And I think there's an element of self-confidence, shall we say, ego maybe, but there's an extreme confidence in himself intellectually that, you know, in any way, any smaller platform that The Economist would not be suitable for him. He's a kind of world intellectual. I think he sees himself as in that way, a very honest one and a very passionate one, but he does see himself that way. So you're right that, but then he thinks of reaching a broader audience that way, and he never compromises on his views. And when he decides that he's going to write for the bourgeois press, as he calls it, he is almost at fault in how punctual he is before he tells the editor-in-chief of whichever publication he's writing for that he's a Marxist, and that his politics are very clearly on that side.
Mm-hmm.
But why is he so unknown in Poland? Well, he was written off in Poland. There are some interesting contacts between the Polish embassy in London after the war, and then later on Warsaw and the Deutschers in the 1950s. Attempts to try and see whether maybe Deutscher would consider sending some article, some essay to some of the leading intellectual journals in communist Poland, in the People's Republic of Poland at the time, and to see maybe some links can be established, and they fall through. There's very little trust between both parts. And eventually what Deutscher is saying about the nature of these regimes in a very unimpeachable, objective, high standard, elegant, persuasive way makes him, you know, in a sense, an intellectual figure worth sort of blacklisting. I think it's interesting that in Poland, his work was never totally banned. You could find his books in translation. So you had to go to special sections of the National Library and so on. But a French or an English edition of Stalin or even Trotsky might be there for you to find, as I've been told. And then, of course, some copies would be circulated and handed out by visitors and so on. So it wasn't completely impossible. And the press once or twice mentioned him in the context of his publication successes. But I've been doing a lot of research in Poland, and you know, the Polish state in the 1950s kept a file on Deutscher and intercepted his mail and kept a file on anything that they considered politically dangerous. And this is a section 10 of a particular part of the Polish state dealing with surveillance, and you have the far right-wing terrorist threat, and then you have a small group of Trotskyist intellectuals, and Deutscher is there, and he's got his file, his letters in translation, often from Yiddish or what have you. So they wanted to erase that legacy, that part of the communist story where there had been oppositionists. And I mean, it's very interesting when you try and do research about his time in this Yiddish newspaper, which was a Communist Party front, a Communist Party organ, Literarische Tribune. It's in Yiddish, and Deutscher had been the editor-in-chief of that during his last years in the party before he was expelled. There's a couple of books, memoirs, that talk about it from the vantage point of the 60s, that talk about all that experience. And they almost don't touch him. They got a real problem remembering Deutscher, mentioning Deutscher, and this guy had turned to Trotskyism, better talk about something else, and so on. Finally, Gomulka in the 1960s takes a particular turn, which Deutscher confronts openly in the European press. And so since the mid-60s, Deutscher is just someone that the Polish government, the People's Republic of Poland, doesn't want to have anything to do. Fast forward to the fall of communism and the advent of the Polish Third Republic, the kind of politics, post-communist politics that you have now, and you can't be surprised. Anything that comes under the banner of communism, or the suggestion of being left and progressive and so on, generates political allergies. It's the historical memory is supposed to be about a nation that is deeply religious and deeply nationalist, and is a kind of whole work of the Christian Europe, in a sense. And there's no place for Deutscher in the Third Republic. And so his erasure is never finishes, right? But you can still find stuff he wrote, which is so it's still there. Not all of it has been burnt in different auto da fes, as he might have thought.
I was a student in Poland under Gomulka.
Wow.
In 1968, and the student risings, which is quite universal. I couldn't believe, much more universal than any student rising that I witnessed in the United States during the same period, or in Western Europe either, where there were quite a number of them. And Gomulka, came out and said it was all a question of Zionism and the Polish Jews, and the Jews are always going to create trouble, blah blah blah. And this was horrendous, absolutely horrendous, and no doubt that's what made Deutscher, gag on the whole experience. Do you think there's, I don't know, this is a kind of a bad question to ask someone, but you can't help thinking that maybe along with all this anti-communism, and that doesn't require so much explanation, there's this residual kind of anti-Semitic, I don't know, some kind of little anti-Semitic animus toward Deutscher in Poland.
It's I wouldn't write it out. I think that anti-Semitism in Poland even today is noticeable in some contexts and some public pronouncements and different political statements, and it's there. There's no question. At the same time, there's been a really important effort to try to remember and to try to honor a part of Polish history, which is of course Jewish. And there's a lot of effort, academic and political and so on, to bring that forward. But like any memory and like any legacy, historical legacy, it's deeply contended and contested. But I think that in the end, the Jewish origins of Deutscher, might be convenient in a particular exercise in trying to disremember him. Perhaps one more of these very sort of radicalized Jewish Poles of the interwar years. But I think his politics, his communism, his adherence sort of a very high standard of scholarship and political analysis to the Bolshevik revolution and to that tradition, to that spirit, I think that's more than enough, with or without his Judaism. And I think this is a really important to raise, actually, Anthony, not a bad question at all, because it's kind of ironic that I think Deutscher is well known for Stalin and Trotsky and so on, but I think he's mostly remembered for having written this essay on the non-Jewish Jew and having coined that phrase. And I think there's several ways in which many want to see him mostly in that particular Jewish tradition. I'm not sure that Deutscher himself would have viewed himself in that tradition. So it's an important question. I think it's his Marxism mostly that explains his trajectory, and I say that because in the very few autobiographical documents he left, he's very clear that his Marxism was, in a sense, his Northern Star, his way of making sense of the world.
Well, absolutely fascinating stuff. And we could go on for hours. I definitely could go on for hours, and discuss this with someone who has been through this topic from A to Z, and no doubt we'll go further into the topic as he goes along in writing this book, and which I can't wait to read. Fascinating stuff. And we could go on for hours and have our glass of tea in good Russian style, but we have to conclude. So thanks to Gonzalo Pozo Martin, sorry, not Martin, Martin, sorry, for an illuminating discussion. And goodbye until next time, when we will continue to ask the question, we've tried everything else, why don't we try thinking about it?